morning, everybody. My name is Justin Spindler, and I'm from Interactive Intelligence. I'm here this morning to talk about Entity Framework, specifically how you can use code first to map to existing databases where sometimes you may have to jump through additional hoops in order to get it to work sort of as you may expect. This isn't really an introduction to Entity Framework per se, more of a set of tips and tricks that we've learned over the course of developing a product in-house that I think are interesting and may show off some capabilities of Entity Framework and maybe tools that you can use in your tool belt. This presentation will be entirely about Entity Framework Code First. I will not touch the designer whatsoever. A little background about Code First was it was not released with Entity Framework initially. It actually came out in sort of the second version, which was 4.0, which was released with .NET 4.0. The first version, which was 3.5 for inexplicable reasons. I think they wanted to align the version numbering with the .NET version numbering. Was originally released in 2008, and Code First came out with 4.1, which I believe was released in 2011. Who here had an opportunity to use Entity Framework, the first version, 3.5? Good experiences with it? It's generally not the consensus. It was pretty rough around the edges when it came out for a number of reasons, and one was that just the involvement of configuration in setting up your the entity designer and all that was involved with working with that. So Entity Framework 4.1 came out and was intended to, first 4.0 and then 4.1 came out and it was intended to address a lot of those issues. And Code First, what they attempted to do was solve a lot of the configuration woes by setting up where it would map via convention instead of requiring explicit configuration, and then use a fluent API in order to allow you to have more control over how the database is mapped to your entities. So I'm largely going to be concentrating on the more recent versions of Entity Framework, 6.0 and 6.1, which have been released in the last couple of years, because they've provided a lot more tools in order to give you the ability to customize how Code First allows you to map to the database. This list is far from exhaustive, but these are sort of the subjects I wanted to touch on today because they're very specific to Code First, and they give you a lot of control over the DB context. So we have custom code conventions, which give you the capability of changing sort of context-wide how different properties will map to database objects in terms of, you can globally change the type of data, the database type for a specific framework type. Command interceptors give you the capability of intercepting the DB command as it's being issued back to the database and give you the capability of looking at it, logging it, or even changing it if you wanted to. Code-based configuration moved a lot of the necessity of putting entries into the app config or web config and gave you the ability to do that configuration through a class instead. And then stored procedure mapping, which gives you the capability of mapping the update operations on an entity to stored procedures rather than having it generate dynamic SQL. In Entity Framework 6.1, they also added the concept of custom model conventions, which are a much more advanced form of convention that give you the capability of directly manipulating Entity Framework's underlying metadata. This is also the first release where they decided to attempt to publicly expose that metadata. In all previous versions of Entity Framework, the metadata was all internal and pretty locked down. There are numerous reasons for that. But so also what was in 6.1 was command tree interceptors, where 6.0 provided command interceptors, which give you the capability of intercepting the DB command. The command tree interceptors let you catch the expression trees, which are generated within Entity Framework. Who here has worked with link and expression trees before? So you're familiar with the concept. It's an object model that represents an operation you're trying to perform. Well, Entity Framework, just through its integration with Link, inherits a lot of that, but also has significantly more nodes because it represents almost any database operation that can happen. And through these interceptors, you can capture and then modify or inspect or do whatever you want with those command trees and expression trees. And then finally, they added the capability of, instead of having to write code to set up interceptors, that you can do so through the app config or web config. And I'll actually show an example of that, fairly early on, because one of the simplest examples is extremely useful and gives you the capability of logging all the SQL statements to the database. And being able to do so without changing code is great at runtime if you're having an issue and you can't deploy new production code, but you can modify the configuration. So I mentioned that Entity Framework 6.1 was the first to release a public API to the underlying EDM, the entity data model. The entity data model in Entity Framework is sort of the core mechanism under the hood which handles the translation from link statements or entity SQL, if you actually use entity SQL, into SQL statements for the database. And it does so by mapping CLR object types to basically data tables in your database. There's 5 layers of abstraction within Entity Framework. You start all the way at one extreme where you have your CLR types, your plain old CLR objects, your assemblies and whatnot. That's called the object space. On the far other side of the spectrum, you have the store space, which is your actual database model. Between the two, you have the conceptual model, which is sort of an ERD, an entity relationship diagram, that provides a logical view of the business logic, the business model behind the objects in play, but is actually a separate step above the object model. A lot of times the two are conflated, but the CSDL or conceptual model actually does not map directly to any of the CLR types. This is sort of done intentionally to abstract the CSDL from .NET, where, initially an Entity Framework, but I don't know what their purpose was for doing that, but what ended up happening is now CSDL is a part of the Oasis OData 4 specification and standard, and is used to describe entities that have nothing to do with .NET. Whether you're using a backend that's .NET or not, or a front end that's .NET or not, you can use CSDL to describe these business objects and relationships completely abstracted from the technology. So who here is who has used the Entity Designer in Entity Framework? Have any of you cracked open the EDMX file that thing spits out? So you've probably, well, the few of you who have seen all of these XML files in a sort of raw form. They're not pleasant to look at. They're very sort of obfuscated and complex. And there's some reasons for that, but a lot of it just comes from the history of Entity Framework and where it came from. So between, and this is actually from Microsoft's website. This shows 4 spaces. There are actually 5. The 5th one exists between the object model and conceptual model. It really, I honestly don't know what it's used for. I think it's to specify a mapping between the two, although the mapping is generally 1-to-1. The mapping layer between the conceptual model and the storage model, though, is a little more complicated. It gives you a lot of capabilities to map down to the between the entity types and the database types, with a lot of flexibility in how those types are mapped. And they also work at sort of a database provider level, so that the database types can be different, and the MSL and SSDL can be different for every database that you use. If you were to use multiple databases, multiple types of databases. So the reason for a lot of this abstraction is that a lot of the CLR types don't map very cleanly to database types. I mean, we could start with a very simple example, system.int32, or your typical 32-bit integer. Well, in SQL Server, there's only one data type that maps to that. It's an int. But what data type maps to a system.string? Does anyone know the answer to that question? No? There's, what, 6 of them, depending on which version of SQL Server you're using? So on top of just this type mapping, there's also this concept of facets, where each type can be decorated with an attribute that sort of specifies a little bit of behavior about that type. For an example, the EDM string mapping, you could decorate the EDM string, which is the name of the string in the conceptual model. Like I said, it's not directly mapped to the CLR types. You can specify on EDM.string that its facets are that it's 100 characters long, that it's fixed length, and that it is not Unicode, which tells the, did I say it was fixed length or not fixed length? Well, not fixed length, and 100 characters, and so that tells, when it has to figure out what type that maps to, that tells Entity Framework that that's a varchar 100, as opposed to an nvarchar 4000 or an nvarchar max. So this is complicated. It's a pain to work with, but they expose this to sort of give a lot of control over the underlying data model and how it's used from code first. If you were to deal with the XML files directly, even skipping the Entity Designer, you get all the control and all the power of Entity Framework. Unfortunately, neither code first nor the Entity Designer exposes all of that, at least without having to crack open that EDMX file, which then if you refresh from the database, all your changes are gone. So I have a series of demos to show here. I'm going to start with this little cute web application that I sort of came up with on the fly a couple of days ago. I call it geekygames.net because really every programmer is a subclass of a kid, right? So these are, cute little toys and games that may appeal to the techie crowd. This company per se wants to put together sort of a web presence, and they have an old database that they're inheriting from, so they want to translate that through Entity Framework code first into this web application. So let's go and take a look at the code a little bit. Oops. So take a look at the catalog context. It inherits from DB context. I really didn't want to have that initializer in there. I would love to have just shown off that it contained a single property, but unfortunately without that initializer, Entity Framework really wanted to create a new table for me and would go out of its way to try and screw up my database. So that's why I have set initializer to null there. That basically tells Entity Framework code first, shut off all your migration logic, shut off everything that you do normally when you try to connect to a database in order to make sure that database is in the state you expect it to be. Without that there, the first thing Entity Framework does, hits that database, looks for a games table. If it doesn't find a games table, tries to create one. And then it creates all of its migration tables in order to support the migration capabilities that are inherent in code first. These aren't subjects I'm going to touch on beyond that point because I'm connecting to existing databases, but I just wanted to mention that that's why there's more than one property within this class. Now, the property I did want to show off is this DB set of game called games. DB set basically represents a table or a data source of objects. It's like a repository of these entities. So that's what the DB context looks like. Let's take a look at the game class itself. Well, this thing looks absolutely awful. All the properties in here map basically back to the database thing. Let me actually bring up the table here, give you an idea what that looks like. I probably should have done that first, I'm sorry. So this is what the database looks like. Can I show the field names in here? It's got a PK called ID, title, short version of description, amount, and a pick. Because lots of databases seem like they're naming their columns as if they cost money per character. Doesn't really show it here. I don't know why that is. I could bring it up in SQL Server Management Framework, but these types, I'm going to do that actually because I want to show off exactly what types these things are. Come on. Here we go. It's a little better. It's probably a setting. I'm sorry. Visual Studio 2015 came out and I couldn't resist. So I'm still in the midst of trying to relearn the IDE. So this is what the table schema looks like. You have your primary key. It's an integer, not null. It's a identity, so it's auto-generated. You have a title, varchar 50. You have a description, and varchar 500. The amount is a money, and the pick is a varchar 50. So let's go and fix this POCO, because frankly, this thing is kind of ugly. So I will go here and refactor some of these names. Let's call this game ID. We'll call this name. I don't really like title. We got description, price, and picture URI. So just renamed all those properties. Unfortunately, what I have to now do is go over to the Solution Explorer, and because I'm using Razor, and unfortunately refactoring doesn't work at all with Razor, which is really unfortunate. Maybe it does with ReSharper, but I do not have that installed. No, actually, this looks like, I don't know why this was running. So let me make sure that this at least compiles and can get to the point of showing the, nope, does not compile. So clearly something is probably still, title, here we go. Ah, yes, in the controller, wow, didn't catch that one. And now we'll try to run our application again. This is Edge, again, learning. Can't resist, have to upgrade every single time they release something new, break everything. Command execution exception. Can anyone tell me why that is? Does not match the table. That is right. I just changed all those property names. And if you look, actually, let me point out something else first. I should have done this first. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. So I had mentioned that we had the capability of, through web API, or the web config, registering command interceptors. Well, there's this nice little interceptor built into Entity Framework 6.1 called, a little cutoff here, the database logger interceptor. Give it a name, true or false whether or not you want it to append, and it creates logs for you. So I'm going to go look at that log. I probably have to stop this first. So now this is the SQL statement I tried to issue. Tried to look for game ID, name, description. It obviously could not find the column name game ID, which does not exist. So now I'm going to have to do a little work in order to get Entity Framework and code first to let me work with this entity and use the names I want to use. So I'm going to override on model creating, and in on model creating, I'm going to create a configuration model builder for this entity. And in here, I will map the properties to their respective database names. As column name, I also want to mention that this entire demo is basically a long extension of itself, so if any of these things start to fall apart, we're going to get to end early. Hopefully that is not the case. What am I up to? Price, has column name, AMT, config, property. I think this is the last one. Has column name, oops, not has column order, has column name. I think it was called pick. All right, so let's take this and try to run it now and see what happens. If everything goes well, we should see the page again and not get an entity command execution error, I think it's called. Yep, there we go. Let's close the page, stop the project. For some reason, it wouldn't reload this. Did I close the log file? What did I do with it? So I put that in C, logs, geeky games. Here we go. So now you can see that all the property names have been renamed back to the original database names so that the SQL statement operates correctly and the mapping can succeed. So the next thing that's a problem here is that, and this really affects updates more than it does selects, is that Entity Framework is trying to guess these property types. It's just system.string. It doesn't tell it a whole lot about these property types. So the type it actually guesses to use is an nvarchar 4000. If you were in the using query plans talk yesterday, you probably heard that mismatching your your data types with your parameters to the types of the tables can generate pretty nasty query plans, especially the mix between Unicode and non-Unicode types. Because SQL Server is not able to just do a direct comparison. It can't do a string seek. It actually has to interpret the difference between the Unicode version and the non-Unicode version to see if they were equivalent by the collation. So we had a number of varchar 50s in here, or varchar 50s. It was actually sort of the default property type for the strings. So I have two choices here. I can either go in here and off of title, I can say has column type. Actually, I think there's a couple different ways of doing this. I can do is Unicode false and has max length 50. And that tells Entity Framework that title is a varchar 50. I can do this for title and description, but you know what? We'll say that there's a lot more fields in this database, there's a lot more types, and by default, almost all of them are varchar 50s. So rather than decorate everything except for the ones that are different, let's go and change the default type for strings so that all strings are treated like a varchar 50. So we'll go in here and we'll tell the model builders that properties of type string is Unicode is false. Oops. Has max length is 50. It kind of formats terribly. So now I'm telling Entity Framework that all strings, by default, are not Unicode and are only 50 characters long. But we still have one field that is not an varchar 50. We have description, which is an nvarchar 500. We could just come down here and change description in the configuration here, but I want to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to go to game, I'm going to go to description here, and I'm going to add string length, which I'm going to have to look up here. In system component model data annotations, I'm going to use the string length attribute and tell it that the maximum length is 500. So that gets me halfway there. I'm now dealing with a varchar 500 because the default convention is that all strings are not Unicode, they're 50. This overrides the 50, but this can't tell it that it's Unicode. And unfortunately, there are no data annotations built into Entity Framework or into the data annotation assembly, which is more for validation than it is for description, that tells it that this is Unicode. So what I'm going to do is come over to a Solution Explorer, and I'm going to create a new attribute. I'm going to put it up here in geekygames.data. So I'm going to call it Unicode attribute. Which is a type attribute. So I have to tell it that it's an N. With the attribute usage targeted to a class. That's really all I need to do. I mean, I could add a property here, true or false, if I wanted to have control over it, but I really don't have to. So I can come back here to game, and I can now put the Unicode attribute on here, which I'm going to have to... Oh yeah, that's right. The default accessibility is internal. Thank you for catching that. I probably have to build to find it. Oh yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. These demos go a lot better when you do not have an audience, believe me. Come on, Rosalind, catch up. Oh, now it did find the type. Use geek. There we go. Now it should be happy. Now, of course, I just added an attribute to the description property. It doesn't really do anything. I have to tell Entity Framework about it and what to do with it. So I'm going to create a convention. Now we'll call it Unicode convention equals new column attribute to column convention. Sorry, these names are a little long and these screens have horrible resolution. And I will tell it that I want to use the Unicode attribute, which that's not the one I want to use. Actually, no, I'm sorry. This is not what I want to do right now. What I want to do is instead is go use the code convention and instead I'm actually blanking on how to do this at the moment. I'm so sorry. Maybe it is column, attribute to column. I'm sorry, I'm completely losing the plot on this one, so I'm going to just go down here and sort of skip this section. Fortunately, it's not all that critical. If I think about it, I will go back here and fix this. So I'm just going to has column type, or is Unicode true, and has max length of 500. It gives me the same sort of effect. I wanted to show that you could do this through an attribute. I'm going to think about this and how exactly to do this the second this presentation is over. But you know what? I actually wrote it down. Now I'm really annoyed at myself. And this is right. Oh, man. You know what? I didn't write down enough to actually remember how to do this. I'm so sorry. So I'm just going to move on to the next thing in this list, is that now we have this configuration for an entity. Works well. It sets everything up. It doesn't do exactly the way I wanted to do it. Believe me, there is a way to map those attributes so you can actually tell Entity Framework that that if the attribute exists on the property, to do something differently with it. So we have this entity type configuration within the catalog context at the moment. If we had a lot of different entities, this file could get pretty big. And you end up sort of back in the same space that you were when you had an EDMX, where now you're maintaining one giant file which contains all these different mappings in it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to I can't do it here. I'll have to do it back here. I'm going to create a new configuration item that allows me to set the configuration for this entity type outside of the context itself. So I'll call it game entity configuration. Oh, and I started from scratch. That's probably not what I wanted to do. Game entity configuration, and it will inherit from entity type configuration of type game. Tell Roslyn to find it. So what it lets me do is in this constructor here, I can take my code for the DB context from the catalog context and just sort of move it wholesale into this other class. What I don't need to do here is actually create the config though, because I am a config. So I will just use the property method, which exists directly on top of the config. And now I have the configuration type separated, but now I just have to tell the model builder about it. So if I run this, I should see the same page that I have before, but what I've been able to do is move explicitly map the configuration between the CLR object and the database and move that mapping outside of the context itself. And you can have any number of these entity type configurations. You can so that you can maintain them separately from one another. So if I'm sure anyone in here who's worked with a large EDMX and has source control probably have run into issues with it. This allows you to sort of split it up and move them apart so you don't have that kind of contention with source control. So the next thing I want to do, the default bootstrap for code first, what it does in order to find its entities is it looks for properties, public properties of DB set. And for the generic type parameter, in this case game, that's an entity it attempts to map. So by default, Entity Framework is looking for any game POCO and is using that as a part of the conceptual model and mapping that back to the database. But now that I've told Entity Framework explicitly about game by using this game entity configuration, I don't need this anymore. Oh, I have to stop the project. Integration with Edge is not as good as it is with the other browsers. You actually have to tell Visual Studio when the browser's not running anymore. So if I run this now, I have a little bit of a problem. Games no longer exists. So what I'd have to do from the consuming code is instead of using the property directly, tell it to call the method set of type game. That's basically the same thing. It tells the DB context that I want a DB set of games. So I can do this all over the place and it'll run well. Or at least, run as well as it did before. Oops, they are methods. And this should compile and everything should be happy again. I'm on Edge. There we go. So it worked fine. The only problem with this method is that it's not very discoverable, is it? You have to call a method, you have to know which entity type you want. So you have to jump through a couple of hoops, which may not be all that necessary. So what my preference here is, I'll come in here and I'll add, I have to stop the project, sorry. So I will add a new class. I'll choose class this time. Catalog, context. And in catalog context extensions, I can add some extension methods, which just make this easier for me. Now, you don't have to do this. There's nothing special about doing it this way. But what it does let you do is it gives you the ability to advertise, actual methods that people can then discover without having to, have to know more about the model. So if I go back to home controller, I can replace set.game with .games, which, did it put it in a different, oh, yeah, it did. So I can just call context.games, and it does, this is the exact same thing it was doing before, except now from an end user's perspective, it's a little nicer, it's a little more discoverable. Furthermore, and this again, just a little tip that I kind of like, is that I can go here and sort of put common sort of behaviors in one place. So that's search method. I had in home controller here. Now home controller needs to know what to do if someone wants to search. They pass the query string search. It needs to know if I want to search the exact logic that it's going to do on the iQueryable in order to carry out a search. In this case, it uses an additional where clause and does a contains operation on the game's description. Well, if I wanted to change that and I had this search capability in multiple places, well, that means I have to change code in multiple places. So I'll go back to the set of extension methods, and I can put that logic here. I'll just use the other extension method. Game description contains search. and then return the query. And because it's an iQueryable, I can continue to use link operations against it. Oh, string. Why did I do that? So I can go back to home controller and get rid of everything else here. Give this a run, should compile, does not compile. Something stupid. Yep. Give it another run. Should have failed by now. At least it compiled, so it should be doing the exact same thing. And we should get our little listing page up here again. And our little search box should work. So we can put laser in here. And there's our laser maze product. Go back to our listing. So the next thing I want to do is probably a little bit different. What I want to do is sort of refactor these guys out of the web application. So all I'm going to do is just sort of wholesale copy, paste. I'm going to move these guys up to geekygames.data. Make sure this at least builds. So by doing that, I've moved these entities in this context so that it's no longer dependent on the web application. It's not built into the web application. Other people can take dependencies on it and use it. That's only really one step, though. What if I want to use the POCOs elsewhere and don't really want to take the dependencies on Entity Framework? What I could do in that case is move, got the move extension, these guys over to Geeky Games entities. Did I move something? Oh, the extension method. Did it change the name? Games models. Maybe I just need to rebuild. Oh. No, I should have the reference in there. Let me see here. Geeky Games data. Maybe I don't. Maybe you're right. I think you're right. Sorry about that. Again, these things work so much better when you don't have an audience. So now our issue, the catalog context is in a separate assembly from the game POCO. And unfortunately, because of the reference, the catalog can't actually take a dependency on the same assembly that the game POCO is in, because that assembly takes a reference back to this assembly. So I can't directly add the configuration. But what I can do is tell it to go look for some assemblies that may have configurations. I'm sorry, I do a lot of Java lately, and I just keep switching back and forth between syntaxes. So now I should be able to rebuild. Everything good now? Please, yes, good, awesome. No whammies, no whammies.
So you put the POCOs in their own assembly?
I did.
And then what else did you put in configuration?
Configuration was in there too. And it's actually possible to split them up more, but it requires creating a number of assemblies that I didn't want to go into that level of depth with this talk. Now, can anyone think of reasons why you might want to do this? I mean, one could be separation of concerns. Let's say you want to use game elsewhere, but you don't want to take a dependency on entity framework. Now, in our case, that assembly has to take that dependency on entity framework because I mixed the configuration and the entity into the same assembly. But with, I guess, 2 extra assemblies in play, you could eliminate that dependency. Another thing you can do here is that the context has no idea what POCOs, what entities it's using. You could add more later. And this is actually a very sort of interesting part of the project that we were building where we decided to do this, is that the project is sort of like a CRM, where its core data types, there's only a handful of them. They're very basic, but like any CRM project and product that anyone uses, no one uses it out of the box. So we wanted to have the capability of extending its data model and giving developers the ability to use that data model with our data model without having completely separate contexts. Because once you do that, you can't query between them anymore. If you want to join between one of our objects and one of your objects, you're sort of out of luck. But by using this sort of entity discovery through just finding these configurations, drop a DLL on the web project. You're sort of done. The context will find it, pull it up, and it becomes a valid part of that model. That may not apply to everyone. It probably doesn't apply to everyone, but it actually became sort of a critical part of that project, and I thought it was quite interesting. So let's see. I'm running a little low on time, so I might skip the custom interceptor. Besides, if there's DBAs in the audience, they would get really annoyed, because that interceptor, you know what, I'll just do it, because I've explained it enough that I kind of have to now. So I'm going to add an interceptor, a command interceptor. What command interceptors do, and I have to stop the project again, is they give you the ability to intercept the DB command as it's being issued to the database. Now, I did mention the one I set up in configuration that just does logging, which I haven't been showing all that much. I'll show it a little more later. But this one's going to do something a little different. I don't want a code file. I want a class. Do half that work for me, please. Isolation level interceptor. Well, and I misspelled it, but who cares? IDB interceptor. Come on, where's the little tooltip? No quick action available here. This should not work. Okay, now I'm a little annoyed. I wasn't going to show this. I'm not going to show this. In short, you get methods that say begin executing and end executing. It hands you a DB command. And in the begin executing, you can change the command text at will. And I was going to show that you could prepend a little set isolation level to read uncommitted, which gives DBAs heart attacks because you're shutting off. You're turning on dirty reads effectively and allowing, it sort of cuts down on contention in some cases, but you generally don't want that. I don't know why this is compiling though. That should be an interface that has required methods. Okay. So one thing I really wasn't planning on showing at all until I went to the query plan conversation or talk yesterday was the mapping to stored procedures. And I'm only going to show this quick because I really didn't have a plan to talk about it at all. But Entity Framework 6.0 did provide the capability of mapping to mapping entities to stored procedures for create, update, and delete operations. And the syntax is pretty easy, but because I have so many mappings, and I intentionally created some nasty-looking stored procedures to make to sort of fit in the whole existing database concept where generally you're dealing with someone else's work who decided, again, that, characters cost a lot of money or whatever they did. So the names are, the entity framework, when it tries to map these stored procedures, does so by convention. So by default, the insert stored procedure for a game would be insert underscore game. And the parameters it would use are all named after the same properties on the entity. So instead of ID or whatnot, the property would be game ID. But you do have the ability to override that. And just a snippet here, throw this in here. And I don't have a model builder anymore, and I don't need entity anymore, because now I'm dealing with the configuration directly. So here's mapping to stored procedures. So, and doing a little bit of overriding on it. So I'm telling it the names of the stored procedures, add game instead of insert underscore game. I'm changing the names of the properties to the names of the parameters because they're using the old form. Here I'm passing back a result set from the add game, which contains a single value called new ID, which is the newly created sequence that, because I'm telling it it's a result, Entity Framework's going to update that POCO that I told it to update with the new ID so that we can display it immediately if we need to or want to. And then same with update. Update, actually, you can pass 2 parameters here. If you want an original, if you want to do some, if you wanted to do some consistency checking, whether make sure that someone else hasn't changed it on you, it'll use whatever the properties or values are in the POCO. And if they're changed, it'll consider that a concurrency exception. Actually, you're sort of responsible for handling that in your stored procedure, but gives you the ability to do concurrency checking to ensure no one else has changed changed the row beneath you. So I'll run this again. I have a little, I added a little delete button onto my screen, which makes no sense for an e-commerce site, right? But sometimes these demos have to be a little bit contrived. So we'll go up here and we'll delete, what do you think we should delete? Let's get rid of Ollie. It's awesome, but it doesn't really fit with the rest of these toys. This little cute screen. Do I wish to delete this item? It worked, that's great. So I'll go back here and stop this project. I believe I still have the log open. I hope I do, yes I do. So here, these are all the SQL statements that were logged during this session. I have it set to override every time I run so that I don't have to dig all the way to the end. So here you can see it's calling dbo.remGame, and it's passing the ID of 4, and that's the only parameter it's passing. That's all I told it to pass. And it's performing the delete operation. So let's see, I have 10 minutes left. What other things do I want to do? So let's run this demo again. And I'm sort of like, takes too long to run this thing, which kind of stinks, but. Let's go look for a product. I want to find robot turtles. So I look for a robot. Where's robot turtles? I know it was in the list. If I go back to the listing, it's there. Well, our problem was that robot turtles isn't in the description. All we're doing in our search is searching on the description. Well, there's a couple ways we could fix this. We could just have the query perform a search over both name and description. That would work well enough. But, that doesn't really buy all that much. I mean, search operations, especially with contains, create like statements and with wildcards on both ends. So, I have, 5 rows here? You have a lot of rows. That's a pretty expensive database operation. Not to mention, you can't take advantage of some more interesting capabilities. So I have a function that I created called dbo.search. And I will show it. And this function uses full text search in order to look at the title and the description based on a term that is passed in. So I'm going to map that into my application here. Not configurations, entities, here we go. So I'm going to create a new static, I gotta stop the project, sorry. new class. I'm going to call it catalog context functions. You can call it whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. And in catalog context functions, so just a note, all this thing returns is IDs. It doesn't actually return the games. So I need to map this as an iQueryable event. And I will call it search. And it will take, I'll call it term. Now I will map this into my context, but of course it only makes sense in the context. I'm not actually going to perform my full text search in this code. Unsupported, not implement, not supported. Again, too much Java. So what I'm going to do here is actually, I have sort of this pre-written convention. This is a model convention which uses the EDM to modify the uses the public EDM API to modify the underlying metadata in order to add in the entries for a function import. This is not very clean looking code, and I'm sorry, it's largely the fault of the EDM. No, this is actually the convention itself, which doesn't have to do a whole lot of work. But it actually relies on a whole series of other classes which create the EDM payloads, like the EDM function payload and the EDM function, which are the EDM objects that represent the function. And it has to do so in two places. It has to do it at the store level in order to public. It has to do it at the SSDL and the store level in order to make the database function available, and it has to do it at the conceptual level so it's callable through EF. And on top of that, it also has to map it in the mapping layer. So if you were doing this in XML, it's actually pretty easy to do. It's kind of a shame that the entity designer kind of makes it hard because it likes to overwrite your XML after you change it. In code first, it's a lot more painful. There are a couple separate projects out here that demonstrate this capability. One actually written by a member of the EF's team, which is probably a lot better than mine. But this is the one I wrote for our project he and I were writing it sort of at the same time. And I'm a little proud of this. I was actually responsible for a pull request which made some of this possible. Oh yeah, Entity Framework 6, it's open source. And they're actually pretty friendly. So find something wrong with it, and there are things wrong with it, issue some pull requests. So I have this store function attribute. It's an abstract class. On top of that, I have tabular function attribute. Tabular function attribute does half the work. Well, it just sort of specifies that it exists. And then I have a stored function convention, which does the work of actually discovering those attributes. And in this apply method, so I'll show you the store function convention is an iStore model convention of an entity container. What that means is that this convention applies at the store space of the EDM as opposed to the conceptual space. And it applies to the entity container within the store space. The container contains all the entity sets, which refer to all the entities and all the functions and so on. The reason you do it at the store model is the conceptual model is built first, and then the store model is built after the fact for every single database provider you want to hit. So at this stage, both sides of conceptual and store are already complete. The mapping is already half done. So all I need to do here is add in the entries I want and the mappings I want. So first thing I do is I try to find all the types that have the attribute on it, store function attribute, and then I use a builder, that builder function I was just showing you, which creates the functions and adds them into the conceptual model. So here the conceptual model, which is the model.conceptual model. I'm adding function imports to it, and then at the bottom adding a function import mapping between the two function imports, the one into the store and the one in the conceptual. I better do this quickly. This is one of the things I definitely was not going to live demo just because of the amount of code that's involved, and it's not pretty. Let me take a dependency on my other assembly here, which I called it EFX to be cute. tabular function. Here we go. So now I have tabular function, and I need to tell it which data context I want to use. Context. Yes, good. I'm going to give it the function name. This is the conceptual function name. This could be practically anything as long as it's unique. I need to give it the store function name, which is search. Very clever. And I can optionally give it a schema. Make that DBO. And by default, what this is going to look for is a result set containing a table where with one column of ID, but because or not ID, a value, but because I renamed that, I'm going to have to specify that the scalar result column is, I believe it's ID. Let me double check. Yes, it's ID. So I also need to go back to my context, just down here, and tell it to use my convention, because without my convention in place, it's actually not going to do anything, and this is going to blow up. So I will add my new store model convention. Did I not take it to pen? I did not take it to pen. Let me add EFX just so I can get some IntelliSense here and make sure I do this right in the next 2 minutes. Store function convention. That takes a parameter of the assemblies I want to map to, but I just want to do all the assemblies. So I'll just build it, make sure that all builds. But now I need to go back and actually change my search implementation, which is in this extension method here, which is nice because now I can change it in one place and everyone gets this capability. So instead of doing description.contains, I can do catalog, context, functions. That's in entities. Let me put that back in models. Search with the search term, which I call search, contains game.game ID. So now I'll run this, and hopefully this will work. I was having a little trouble with this last night. Actually ran into another EF bug, which I'm going to report and hopefully fix maybe this week, if they're willing to accept my pull request, dealing with some details of the EDM itself, and I can explain that if I have a second. So let's go look for robot turtles now. Robot turtles. So let me close this, stop the project. We're going to look at the generated SQL just to confirm that that's actually what it did and there was no magic behind the scenes. And did I close that again? I did, didn't I? So let me go back to C logs. Geeky Games log. Where did it do it? Here we go. So here you see it's doing where exists, select one from C1, does its cute little mapping things, and it's calling dbo.search. And then mapping the result of that in this exist statement. So I'm calling a tabular function of scalar results and using that to perform a full text search. Unfortunately, you can't use the full text directly just because of the nature of that function. It just doesn't take standard parameters. You have to pass it a list of column names, and there's no real way to map that in EF. But through another user-defined function, this is fully possible. Let's see here. I'm at actually 9 o'clock, so I had a couple more demos I wanted to show off, which is kind of a shame. I guess I won't have to steal Rowan Miller's demo. Entity Framework 7. I'm going to blow through this really quickly. They're effectively rewriting Entity Framework for Entity Framework 7. They're doing this because Entity Framework's got a long history of cruft. It was originally released in 2008, but actually had its start back in around 2001. It was originally called Object Spaces, and which was supposed to be released in Visual Studio 2005 as Microsoft's first foray into ORMs for .NET, but that got sucked into the black hole that is called WinFS. There are actually some very interesting blogs online by Microsoft employees who have some choice words to say about WinFS. I won't go into them. I'm going to try and keep positive. But when WinFS was shut down eventually, a lot of its parts were sort of split apart into other projects. SQL Server 2008 got FileStream, and the underlying EDM and the ORM on top of that became Entity Framework. So with its close to 15 years worth of history, it's got some sort of really old style coding in it. I didn't show you the interceptor example, but interceptors can only be added through a static method, and they're done globally. And the reason is because the interception is done at such a low level, there really was no way to do it through like a dependency injection or to pass it through the context down to that layer without really breaking things. So with Entity Framework 7, they're going to gut the underlying core of the entity of the project. They're going code first only because, as they say, ever since code first was released, even though it had a 3-year, even though the designer had a 3-year head start, the telemetry shows that code first is largely what people use. That doesn't mean that visual designers are going away. Don't want to do Rowan Miller's talk here, but it just means that whatever the EDM designer, the designer spits out is going to be code, not blobs of XML. And they're going for a more modular design where a lot of it's built around all these methods for RDBMSs and mapping to specific RDBMSs. They're going to approach it more like Owen does in ASP.NET, where you get this core concept of constructing a metadata object, and then you bring in new assemblies, and it'll have extension methods that say, use SQL Server, and so on. So you only need to subscribe to exactly what you need in order to perform your mapping. Also support for non-RDBMSs, which is, they're not trying to do something magic here and make RDBMSs and non-RDBMSs behave the same way. They want to do it in a way that makes sense for the non-RDBMS. So for like mapping to something like a table store or something like that, you can create an entity, store it by ID, get it back by ID, do some searching. You can't join between them because a lot of times those like NoSQL databases don't really have that concept. And Entity Framework 6 is open source. I think it's one of the Microsoft public licenses, something like that. But Entity Framework 7 has moved to Apache 2.0, and it's up on GitHub. So, and they are even more friendly about accepting patches. Their whole process is built around that. So additional resources, presentation content, still sort of compiling that, is going to be up on Bitbucket under Justin Spindler /COTB, Code on the Beach 2015. And then here's the 2 repositories for Entity Framework 6 and Entity Framework 7. So the last thing I wanted to say is, for those people who did not attend, this was the view of in the Bahamas. I think I'm on top of the pirate ship bar, looking back at the boat. So I wanted to say thank you to Paul Irwin, Kate Irwin, their families, and everyone else who's been involved with Code on the Beach. I've honestly been having a blast at these conferences. Code on the Sea was fun. I'd love to see more faces at that. It's nice to have a small crowd, but honestly, it's like, I'd love to see that take off more. So here's the beautiful Bahamas, and that's it. Any questions? Sorry about that. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming.